So there was a piece I didn't talk about too much in the transform stage, and that's model assumptions. And the reason for that is that model assumptions are often difficult to understand. There's two types of model assumptions in my mind. One is what we call simplifying assumptions. So there are decisions that I make as a modeler to include certain things, but not include everything, so I get something that's I can get my hands around. So for example, in the persistence problem, there could be all kinds of reasons why a patient didn't come back. They didn't come back because they lost a lot of weight and they didn't feel like they had to come back, or they could have not come back because they didn't lose enough weight and they were embarrassed to talk to Dr. Cottom again. None of that was included in my model. If you include too much information, it's like taking a zoom out view on a Google map and you have so much information you actually can't find what you're looking at is my house. You can't find my house from that information. On the other hand, if I start weeding away too much information, I'll zoom in too much and I'll get something that's meaningless, which is the roof of my house. So if this was a way for you to get to my house, both of these images would be meaningless and useless to you. So you want to balance those simplifying assumptions so you're simple enough that you get something out of your model, but you're not too simple and your model is bogus. The second kind of assumption is what we call a first principles assumption. You look at some reasoning and justification from either data or analysis or something that makes sense, and then you put that together in an assumption. For example, there's a model that we have that we assume that people who interact with each other interact similar to molecules bouncing around. And if they interact this way, we can write down that as an assumption and then use it in an infectious disease model. So that's another kind of an example where we're using something called first principles. Do people really move around like molecules? Well, there's some justification for it. It does look like people do move around in certain ways. And I'm not going to go into that, but that's one other type of assumption. So these two types of assumptions must be listed out in your model before you actually give your model to consume to somebody else. So let's go back to pencil and paper and talk about that. Okay, I talked about assumptions. Assumptions are one of the most difficult things because they are decisions that are made by the modeler themselves. And even when you make those decisions, you don't even realize you're making those decisions as you put down your model. So for example, for here, the biggest decision I made was to see what happens if 70% of the population of patients returns on the next visit. So that was an assumption that I'm making that 70% return on the next visit. I made a whole bunch of other decisions too. I didn't put in the model anything about the why. I am ignoring that. So one patient may not come back because they think they lost enough weight. Another patient may be ashamed that they didn't lose weight, so they're not coming back. I don't know that, and I decided to ignore all that. That's the zoom out too far, in my opinion. So I'm just zeroing in on predicting for Dr. Cottom what would happen, how many patients he can expect to see on any clinical visit number by inputting in his initial condition. So what does that mean for Dr. Cottom? Well, when we present models, we always have to tell the consumer what our assumptions are so they don't misuse the model. So if Dr. Cottom gets the model and I don't explain the assumptions, he might use that model for something else. He might use it to say, okay, this is what happens. These might be how many patients I can expect to see in the third office visit for any case, any scenario. No, this was just the scenario if I have a 70% persistence rate. So that needs to be very clear and upfront. And that's why we write down our assumptions. They are our contract with the consumer of the model that lets them know what the restraints of the model are. And it also doesn't answer any of the questions that Dr. Cottom was interested in. He had an issue with this 70%. He said, look, how do we know that 70% even helps anybody? How do I know that my clinic is successful if I have 70% of the patients come back for a return visit? We didn't look at that. Probably the outcome for that would be how much weight did they lose? And we would need some kind of measure of what we mean by successful or not. So that was not part of this model at all. And so as we describe the model, that's why we need to define the variables carefully so he understands which variables are being used, that weight was not involved, that there was no outcome that we were trying to maximize or minimize. So all of that has to be up front too, in addition to the assumptions. And so that's why we ask you to practice writing down your assumptions. It's a little bit more difficult to do, though, when you have someone else's scenario that you may not actually be beholden to, and then try to figure out what assumptions you're looking for to put together a model. But that's the overarching reason why we have this, and hopefully we can practice this in other ways throughout the semester so it's clear at least what you should demand when someone presents a model to you.